In early 1943, the humid, suffocating air over New Guinea revealed a truth that no Lockheed engineer in Burbank had anticipated. The P-38 Lightning, America's most advanced twin-engine fighter, was struggling against the A-6M0 in the very environment where it was needed most. On paper, the P-38 was untouchable, fast, heavily armed, and capable of climbing like a rocket. In high-altitude intercepts, it dominated Japanese bombers and outpaced their escorts with ease. But New Guinea was not Europe, and the realities of the Southwest Pacific demanded a very different kind of fighting. Missions launched from Dabadura and Port Moresby descended quickly into knife-range battles above treetops, where visibility was poor, air was thick, and dogfights compressed into brutal turning contests. In these low-altitude engagements, the vaunted Lightning suddenly felt clumsy. Pilots reported that in hard turns, the elevator shook violently, the tail buffeted, and the aircraft began to hunt unpredictably. It was not aerodynamic compressibility. That phenomenon plagued P-38 pilots at high speed and high altitude. This was something else, a vague, mushy feel in the elevator, caused by slack in the trim tab linkage and inconsistent tension in the control cables that ran through the twin booms. At low speed and high angle of attack, the elevator simply did not bite cleanly. Pilots found themselves hauling back on the yoke while the Zero, lighter and built for low-speed maneuvering, carved inside their turn with frightening ease. Reports from 5th Air Force units poured in through the spring of 1943. Elevator shudders in tight turn, heavy stick, poor response, cannot match Zero below 5,000 feet except in dive. Lockheed responded with pages of engineering explanations and assurances that the P-38 had been designed for high-altitude European combat, not tight jungle dogfights at 300 feet. One engineer even wrote, "The aircraft performs within expected tolerances." But expected tolerances meant something very different to pilots who were burying their friends on Dabadura's red airstrips after every mission. Combat diaries from the 39th and 431st Fighter Squadrons captured the frustration vividly. Lieutenant Jack Purdy wrote, "We have the speed, but not the teeth. She shakes like a wet dog in the turn." Another pilot was harsher. "The Zero owns the horizontal plane. We own nothing if we can't turn in to brake." The Lightning could dive away, yes, but dive and run was not always an option when missions required escorting lumbering A-20 Havocs or strafing convoys crawling along the Japanese-held coasts. Worse, Japanese pilots had learned to bait P-38s into low-speed merges, then trap them in tightening spirals. A veteran of the Tainan Air Group described the tactic. Force him to pull too hard. The big one shakes, the pilot hesitates, and then he is ours. By mid-1943, P-38 losses were rising during low-altitude operations, an unthinkable pattern for an aircraft that was supposed to be the technological answer to the nimble Zero. Squadron mechanics fought endlessly with cable tension adjustments, trying to remove the slop from the trim tab system, but they were bound to Lockheed's specifications. Anything outside the manual was labeled unauthorized modification, and unauthorized modifications were the fastest way to lose your job, your rating, or your aircraft. Still, combat pressure built like steam in a sealed boiler. Pilots were dying, missions were failing, and no official fix was coming. In this atmosphere of desperation, far from California, surrounded by mud, mosquitoes, and the smell of avgas, rumors began to spread. Some pilots whispered that the elevator problem would eventually be solved by a major redesign. Others said they simply needed more practice fighting the Zero style. But a quiet few, mostly the younger flyers, believed something simpler was wrong. The Lightning's elevator system just wasn't tight enough for jungle dogfights. Among those younger pilots was a wiry, sharp-eyed first lieutenant of the 431st Fighter Squadron named Roger Hap Hayes. Hayes had flown enough sorties to understand the P-38's strengths and weaknesses better than the engineers who had built it. He loved the Lightning, trusted its engines, and knew its guns were the best in the theater. But he also knew something was fundamentally off in the way the aircraft responded in high-G turns. More importantly, Hayes possessed the one trait that the Southwest Pacific rewarded more than any technical degree. He paid attention to small things.
He watched mechanics adjust control cables. He studied how trim tabs vibrated on takeoff. He traced the linkage through the tail booms and felt, quite literally, the slack with his own hands. Hayes began telling anyone who would listen that the elevator issue was mechanical, not aerodynamic. The engineers dismissed it. Some pilots laughed at him. But the war in New Guinea did not care about design boards or factory manuals. It cared only about who lived through the next sortie. And Hayes, chewing on the problem night after night as Zero pilots continued to outturn and outrate American fighters in the weeds, started to consider a fix so simple and so unorthodox that no engineer would ever take it seriously. A fix that involved nothing more than a strip of metal, 2 bolts, and a length of wire. A fix that would be ridiculed, forbidden, and eventually credited with changing the way the P-38 fought in the Southwest Pacific. Hayes had not yet acted, but the seed had been planted. The Lightning was about to receive one of the most unlikely battlefield upgrades of the entire war.
Roger H. Hayes was not an engineer by training, but months of wrenching on his own P-38 with Dobodora crew chiefs had given him an instinct that no factory diagram could match. He knew the Lightning's elevator cables were too loose for the violent, low-speed, high-G dogfights the Southwest Pacific demanded. At high altitude or in gentle maneuvers, the slack didn't matter. But down low, when a Zero pulled a brake turn and forced a P-38 into a last-ditch maneuver to avoid a burst of 7.7mm fire, that tiny softness in the linkage became a lethal delay. Hayes kept saying it. The Lightning isn't slow, it's sloppy. Tighten the system and she'll turn. His squadron mates rolled their eyes. They were pilots, not amateur mechanics. Besides, Lockheed had already said the control field was within acceptable parameters. When a major aircraft manufacturer says acceptable, a lieutenant's opinion doesn't carry much weight. But Hayes had an advantage Lockheed's engineers did not. He fought in the plane every single day. He felt the airframe shudder during brake turns, sensed the tail buffet, and knew the exact instant when the elevator refused to bite. And unlike engineers thousands of miles away, he couldn't afford to wait for a memo or a redesign. Zero pilots weren't waiting. On the red airstrips at Dobodora, mechanics worked in sweltering heat, stitching battle damage, patching aluminum skins riddled with shrapnel, and coaxing the twin Allisons back to life after missions that pushed them far beyond factory specifications. These were men who improvised constantly, repairing castings with bushings made from Coke cans, straightening bent panels over wooden blocks, and jerry-rigging coolant lines with whatever metal tubing they had on hand. To them, the line between authorized and functional blurred daily. Hayes saw that spirit and embraced it. One evening, while examining the elevator trim tab linkage with a crusty veteran crew chief named Staff Sergeant Leo Merritt, Hayes finally said the thing he'd been sitting on for weeks. What if we just take the slack out? Not according to the manual, according to reality. Merritt stared at the lieutenant as if he'd lost his mind, then slowly nodded. He'd felt the same looseness. He knew the cable tension specs from Lockheed were written for European intercept fighting, not jungle knife fights. We stiffen that system and the tail stays honest, Merritt muttered. But command is not going to like it. Hayes grinned. Then command won't know. The idea was brutally simple. Use a length of locking wire and a small metal brace to increase tension on the trim tab linkage, effectively eliminating the slack that caused the elevator to flutter in high-G turns. It was small, almost laughably so, something that looked more like a farm boy fix on a tractor than a modification to one of the most advanced fighters in the U.S. arsenal. But function mattered more than appearance. Under cover of dusk, Hayes and Merritt worked with pliers, scraps of metal, and a toolkit worn from months of combat maintenance. They reinforced the linkage, tightened the run of cable, and secured the assembly with locking wire wound tighter than any factory spec called for. The next morning, Hayes ran ground tests. As he moved the controls, he felt an immediate difference. The elevator's response was crisp, snapping to input instead of drifting. The trim tab no longer wobbled. There was no vibration along the yoke. Feels like she's been awake this whole time and just needed coffee, Hayes joked. When other pilots asked what he had done, he answered honestly, a stupid little wire fix. They laughed. One lieutenant called it bush mechanics. Another said, you'll rip your tail off.
A third muttered that Lockheed would court-martial them all for defacing a perfectly good airplane. But Hayes didn't argue. He simply strapped in and took off. Up in the morning haze, he tested the Lightning with a series of high-G turns, then a sequence of yo-yo maneuvers, then a few aggressive brake turns at low altitude. No flutter, no buffet, no dead zone on the elevator. It was the tightest, cleanest control response he had ever felt in a P-38. He landed with a grin that his crew chief instantly recognized. The fix wasn't superstition, it wasn't theory, it worked. But unofficial modifications came with risk. When word reached Lockheed technicians attached to 5th Air Force that Hayes had altered the control system, they immediately filed a report labeling the change non-standard and not approved for field use. One engineer bluntly wrote, "This alteration is unsafe and should be removed," to which Merritt muttered, "Tell that to the Zero pilots trying to turn inside us." For a few days, the squadron joked about Hayes's illegal wire job, and even Hayes himself accepted that command would probably shut it down. Then came the mission that would change everything. A large Japanese formation was spotted moving to intercept Allied bombers near Aral. The 431st Fighter Squadron launched. Hayes strapped into his modified P-38, not knowing he was about to prove, conclusively and violently, that a strip of wire could succeed where an entire engineering team had failed. Within hours, the myth of the stupid wire fix would go up in flames, and the P-38's reputation in the Southwest Pacific would never be the same.
The morning haze over Araway was already breaking when the 431st Fighter Squadron crossed the coastline, sunlight glinting off the twin booms of their P-38 Lightnings. Below them, the sea was flat, calm, deceptively peaceful. An illusion shattered the moment radio chatter crackled through the headsets. "Bandits, 3 o'clock low. Zeke's coming up fast." The Japanese formation had been hunting the B-25 Mitchells that trailed miles behind the escort. Now the Zero pilots saw an opening. Isolate the escorts, drag them down, force a close-in turning fight. It was the same tactic that had cost P-38 pilots their lives for months. And among the Lightnings in the escort screen was the one aircraft most Zero pilots feared least, a twin-engined, heavy American fighter that supposedly couldn't turn worth a damn at low altitude. But they did not know that Hayes's Lightning was not quite standard anymore. The moment the Zero swung upward, Hayes pushed the throttles forward and rolled to intercept. His squadron mates tightened formation, preparing for the usual dance of dive and zoom tactics. But the Japanese pilots refused to give them altitude. They pulled the Americans into the weeds, dragging the dogfight into the treetop realm where the Zero reigned supreme. The first merge was a blur of silver and gray. Hayes sliced across a rising Zero's nose and immediately yanked into a hard left brake, a maneuver that would normally have caused the elevator to shudder violently. But today, there was no shudder, no flutter, no lag. The yoke responded instantly, almost eagerly, like a tightened bowstring. Hayes felt the Lightning bite the air, dig in, and pivot far sharper than it ever had before. The Zero overshot by a full plane length. "Holy hell, she holds!" Hayes shouted into the radio, his voice half disbelief, half exhilaration. He rolled back into the Japanese fighter's wake and fired a short burst. The 20mm cannon shells tore through the Zero's right wing root. The aircraft snapped downward, trailing smoke. Kill number 1. But Hayes had no time to celebrate. 2 more Zeros dropped in from above, their pilots confident they could pin the P-38 into rolling scissors. Normally, they would have been right. The Lightning's sluggish elevator response in this regime made it vulnerable to quick-reaction Japanese maneuvers. But Hayes had something they didn't expect: immediate elevator authority. He yanked the P-38 into a high-G climbing spiral. Again, no buffet, no hesitation. The tail stayed rock solid. Hayes reversed the turn, executed a tight descending yo-yo, and came down right behind the lead Zero. Another burst, another plume of smoke. Kill number 2. Now the remaining Zero pilot realized something was wrong. This P-38 was not fighting like a P-38. It was cutting inside him, inside a Zero, something doctrine insisted was impossible. He tried to force a flat turn, bleeding speed to tighten the radius. Hayes matched him effortlessly.
The stupid wire fix held the elevator firm even as the lightning clawed through the turn, its Allison screaming, wingtips brushing humid air. "Where the hell did you learn to turn like that?" Another P-38 pilot shouted over the headset. Hayes didn't answer. He was too busy closing the gap. At 50 yards, he tapped the trigger. The concentrated fire from the nose-mounted machine gun stitched across the Zero's fuselage. The Japanese fighter exploded into frame and spiraled into the jungle canopy. Kill number 3. 7 minutes had passed. 3 Zeros were down, and every American pilot witnessing the fight knew immediately what they had seen. A P-38 Lightning turning inside Japanese fighters at low altitude as cleanly and confidently as a Spitfire. The dogfight dissolved as the remaining Japanese aircraft disengaged. Hayes climbed out of the treetops, heart pounding, sweat running down his oxygen mask. He barely believed it himself. The Lightning hadn't just survived the turning fight, it had dominated it. And the fix that made it possible wasn't an advanced engineering breakthrough or a factory-approved upgrade. It was a strip of locking wire and a brace installed at dusk in the corner of a dusty Dodobura revetment. Back at Dodobura, ground crews and pilots gathered around Hayes's aircraft the moment it rolled to a stop. Mechanics peered at the tail assembly, shaking their heads in disbelief. Word spread like wildfire up and down the airstrip. Hayes had shot down 3 Zeros in 7 minutes and had done it by out-turning them. The laughter about the stupid wire fix vanished overnight. Squadron leaders demanded details. Crew chiefs crawled under the tailplanes with flashlights. Pilots who had mocked the idea the previous week now asked Hayes to show them the exact location of the modification. "Lockheed says this is unsafe," one mechanic muttered. Merritt grinned. "Tell Lockheed to come fight Zeros down here." The after-action report filed that afternoon was dry, factual, and unemotional, as such documents always were. But buried between the lines was a revelation that would ripple across the entire Southwest Pacific. The P-38 Lightning, with a simple field fix, had finally learned to fight where the Zero had always dominated, and the pilots of Dodobura knew the truth before any engineer did. Nothing about this war would ever be the same again.
By nightfall, the story of Hayes's 7-minute triumph had traveled the length of Dobodura's airstrips, through mess tents, maintenance sheds, revetments, and briefing shacks still stinking of sweat and spilled avgas. People recited it like a campfire myth. 3 Zeros, 7 minutes, a P-38 turning like a damn razor. But the most important detail, the one that made mechanics drop their tools and pilots abandon their meals, was whispered with growing urgency. He did it with that wire fix. Mechanics from the 431st Fighter Squadron were the first to swarm Hayes's Lightning after the mission, but they weren't alone for long. Crew chiefs from the 39th, 475th, and 80th Fighter Groups walked over, pretending they were just curious, but everyone knew they wanted one thing: to see the mod with their own eyes. Hayes stood off to the side, leaning against a fuel drum, helmet dangling from his hand, watching grown men argue over a piece of wire like it was top-secret technology. Merritt, his crew chief and co-conspirator, squatted beneath the tailplane with a flashlight, pointing at the reinforced linkage and the wrapped wire. "It's nothing," he said, almost embarrassed. "We just stiffened the trim tab run, tightened it beyond Lockheed specs." "Beyond specs," one mechanic barked. "It's beyond sanity." "Sanity doesn't shoot down 3 Zeros," someone else replied. The argument didn't last long. In war, results outrank theory, and Hayes had just delivered results measurable in wreckage. Within hours, crew chiefs were dragging their own P-38s into position, lying on their backs in the mud with pliers and locking wire, copying the unofficial modification bolt for bolt. Some improved it, adding extra bracing or cleaner wire wraps. Others asked Merritt to supervise so they do it wrong the right way. By midnight, more than a dozen Lightnings on the Dobodura strips had received the mod. The next morning, Lockheed liaison engineers discovered what had happened. When they saw half the fighters in the 431st sporting unauthorized bracing and tensioned wire on their elevator trim tab systems, they nearly exploded. "This violates every maintenance protocol in the manual," one shouted. "You're putting pilots at risk," another warned. Merritt crossed his arms. "Pilots were dying before we fixed it. You want to fight Zeros down here? Be my guest." The engineers filed formal complaints up the chain of command, labeling the modification unsafe, unauthorized, and non-compliant with approved factory tolerances. But even as they wrote the reports, more P-38s were being pulled into shade tarps for the fix. Lightning pilots had been waiting months for something, anything, that could level the playing field at low altitude. Now, suddenly, they had it, and they trusted the results far more than they trusted paperwork. Over the next week, pilots returning from sorties reported dramatic improvements in handling. The flutter was gone. The sloppy elevator response was gone. The tail buffet and brake turns was nearly gone. The P-38 suddenly felt like a different airplane, alive, responsive, dangerous. Tactics shifted almost overnight. Instead of avoiding low-altitude turn fights, pilots began initiating them. They could now cut into a Zero's first move, forcing overshoots. They could snap into a yo-yo without fear of a dead patch in the elevator response. For the first time in the Southwest Pacific, P-38 pilots fought Zeros in horizontal maneuvering without resigning themselves to being outturned. Combat reports reflected the change. Kill-to-loss ratios climbed. Pilots who previously survived by diving away now found themselves in positions to counterattack. Aces like Jay Robbins, Tommy Lynch, and Gerald Johnson heard whispers of the modification and sent messages through squadron channels requesting details. Even the 475th Fighter Group, home of Richard Bong and Tommy McGuire, the two highest-scoring aces in American history, began incorporating versions of the fix in late 1943. Somewhere deep inside the 5th Air Force Command, officers realized they were watching something unique. A field-borne improvement that had emerged not from a laboratory, not from a wind tunnel test, not from a design board in California, but from a muddy maintenance revetment on the edge of a swamp in Papua New Guinea. And unlike many unauthorized fixes that introduced new problems, this one was producing results with mathematical consistency. Pilots were coming home more often, Zeros were not. Lockheed sent additional warnings, insisting that the mod placed undue stress on the control system. But it was too late. The battlefield had voted. No amount of paperwork could stop a modification that saved pilots' lives. By December 1943, the stupid wire fix, once mocked as amateurish, had become a quiet standard across Dobodura. Crew chiefs added it automatically, unless a commander explicitly forbade it. The 5th Air Force did not officially endorse the mod, but neither did they shut it down. Commanders simply looked the other way. Results in this theater were the only currency that mattered. And as the wire fix spread, something remarkable happened. The Zero, once feared to be unbeatable in low-altitude turn fights, began losing its aura. Japanese pilots were stunned to find lightnings that no longer wallowed in the turn. They expected the usual lag in American controls, but were instead confronted with a fighter that bit hard, held its line, and counter-turned with predatory precision. "The Americans have changed something," one Japanese pilot wrote in a diary recovered after the war. "Their twin-engine fighter turns more sharply than before." For the first time since arriving in the Southwest Pacific, P-38 pilots felt like they were flying a plane that matched their courage. The fix was crude, simple, unapproved. It was also transformational. Dobodura had rewritten the Lightning, not with a factory redesign, but with pliers, sweat, and a strip of wire.
By early 1944, the P-38 Lightning, flying from Dobodura, Nadzab, and Finnshafen, bore little resemblance in feel, if not in form, to the aircraft Lockheed had shipped out of California. The Lightning had not been redesigned, re-engineered, or refitted in any official way. Instead, it had been rewired from the field up, one improvised brace, one tightened cable, one roll of locking wire at a time. What began as a single lieutenant's stupid wire fix had quietly evolved into a new standard within the 5th Air Force. And as mission after mission returned with more victories and fewer funerals,
An unspoken truth settled across the Southwest Pacific. The front line had solved a problem the factory could not. The impact became measurable in combat statistics. After the adoption of the wire fix, P-38 squadrons reported smoother elevator response, reduced buffet, and, most importantly, higher turning performance at low altitude. Where the Zero had once dominated the horizontal plane, it now found an American fighter capable of biting back. In January 1944, multiple squadrons filed reports noting that P-38s held the turn or forced overshoots, phrases that had been virtually unheard of the previous year. The new confidence showed in the way pilots fought. They no longer avoided low-speed engagements. They no longer dreaded the first hard break. Instead, they tempted Zero pilots to turn with them, knowing the Lightning could now match the initial radius long enough to break the Japanese pilot's expectation and sometimes his nerve. As the fix spread across the theater, Lockheed engineers scrambled to understand how a modification they had explicitly rejected could be producing results. Technical teams sent to the front examined aircraft and discovered, to their astonishment, that the field modification did not introduce the structural risk they had predicted. The brace and wire tensioning, while crude, reduced vibration stress by preventing flutter and stabilizing the entire tail assembly. A veteran test engineer later admitted it should not have worked, but it did. The field saw something the wind tunnel didn't. Eventually, Lockheed quietly updated maintenance guidelines for later P-38 production blocks, increasing cable tension ranges and improving trim tab bracing. The company never officially credited Hayes or the Dobodora mechanics. The change appeared in technical orders without fanfare. But among pilots, the truth was well known. The fix came from the mud, not from the factory. The deeper legacy, however, was cultural, not mechanical. What Hayes had demonstrated and what the entire Fifth Air Force came to embrace was the idea that the frontline pilot's experience carried a kind of authority that no engineering textbook could match. In the Southwest Pacific, the environment was the enemy as much as the Japanese. Heat warped metal, humidity weakened fabric, mud swallowed equipment, airstrips cracked under monsoon rains. In such a place, the notion that a factory thousands of miles away always knew better was naive. The battlefield was the true wind tunnel. This realization reshaped U.S. tactical innovation. Field modifications, once frowned upon, became a hallmark of the theater. The P-38's wire fix joined a lineage that included the F-4U Corsair's jury-rigged night fighter conversions, the B-25's gut instinct strafing gun packs in the 3rd Attack Group, and the P-47's makeshift belly tanks forged from scrap. The Pacific became a laboratory where necessity overruled doctrine. As veterans looked back after the war, they spoke of the wire fix not as a technical footnote, but as a symbol of adaptability. Engineering built the plane, war built the fighter, one pilot said. Another, interviewed in the 1970s, put it more bluntly, Lockheed gave us what they could, we gave it teeth. Even Japanese accounts acknowledged the change. Diaries recovered from Rabaul and Wewak described encounters with P-38s that turned more sharply than before and no longer lost stability in brake turns. Zero pilots who had once relied on predictable American weaknesses now found themselves in mortal danger when those weaknesses disappeared. But the most enduring testament came from the pilots who survived because of it. Many credited Hayes directly, calling him the man who tightened the lightning. His name circulated quietly among squadrons, a reminder that innovation often comes not from committees, but from individuals who refuse to accept deadly limitations. Hayes himself never sought recognition. In post-war interviews, he shrugged off praise, saying only, "We were tired of dying in turns." But his modification had saved lives, dozens perhaps, hundreds, by giving P-38 pilots the stability they needed to fight on equal footing with Japan's finest. When the war in the Pacific finally ended and the P-38s were ferried home or scrapped in place, the wire fix disappeared with them. No museum displays it, no technical order acknowledges it by name, no Lockheed documentation celebrates it. But among the men who flew the Lightning in New Guinea, the memory lives on. a strip of wire, tightened in defiance of manuals and experts, that turned the tide of a theater. And that is what makes its legacy so powerful. It wasn't heroic just because it worked. It was heroic because it was born from the raw urgency of combat, from a lieutenant's refusal to accept death as an engineering inevitability, from a crew chief's willingness to trust a pilot's instincts, and from a squadron that believed results mattered more than reputation. The Zero had been the master of the low-speed turning fight for 2 years, but after one unapproved modification, copied under lantern light across Dobodora's muddy revetments, the P-38 Lightning finally learned to fight the way the Pacific required. All because one pilot looked at a sloppy elevator linkage and thought, "I can fix this," and because the war gave him no choice but to try.